Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Todd Green, and I am the Executive Director of WorkRise, a research to action network on jobs, workers, and mobility based at the Urban Institute. I am delighted to welcome you to the opening day of Charting a Resilient Future for U.S. Workers, Solutions to Navigate an Uncertain Economy, an annual conference brought to you by WorkRise and an esteemed group of our partners. But before getting started today, I want to share a few housekeeping items. Our event is being pre-recorded and we'll post the recording on our website after the conference. Speaker biographies, they're available on our event website. We've enabled closed captions for accessibility. You can hide captions or adjust settings with live transcript button. Audience members are muted, but we encourage you to submit questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time. Please take 1 or 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event. We value your feedback. And we encourage you to join the conversation online using the hashtag #ResilientFuturesLive. Over the next 3 days, we will explore some of the key challenges and issues facing workers and employers. We will explore both the complexities and mixed signals of our current labor market, as well as trends that have been building for several decades: rising inequality, wages that have not kept up with the cost of living, and the proliferation of low-wage, low-quality jobs with minimal benefits and protections. And yet, I want to emphasize that this conference is not simply about just defining a problem. Naming and understanding our challenge, they're key steps on our journey towards creating greater economic opportunity for everyone, particularly for Black and Brown workers and others facing structural disadvantages. But we can't just stop there. We must be oriented towards creative, cross-sector solutions, even if some of those solutions are still untested ideas or may require further research and analysis, or even need to be scaled significantly to achieve impact. Today, we've gathered, and over the next few days, the best and brightest minds from across our networks to highlight some of the innovative practices, policies, and programs that have real potential to transform the lives of workers and their families. Over 3 afternoons, you'll hear from nearly 40 visionaries from the worlds of business, worker advocacy, policy, and philanthropy. You'll hear from employer intermediaries, human resources leaders, and talent development and DEI leaders who are actually transforming their organizations from within. You'll hear from WorkRise's growing network of scholars, including several of our grantees who are doing groundbreaking multidisciplinary research on economic mobility. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, you'll hear from workers themselves. Their stories and lived experiences inspire, and they motivate us to create an economy that includes rather than excludes. An economy that has more pathways, ladders, and on-ramps to opportunity rather than dead ends or exits. Our hope is for you to take what you hear over the next several days and apply lessons to your own work in advancing economic opportunity. Whatever your role is in the public, private, or nonprofit sector, we hope you will hear insights over the next 3 days that spark your own ideas and compel you to take action within your organizations. And of course, we're eager to hear your ideas too on how employers and policymakers can create upward mobility. Now, I mentioned our partners who've been instrumental in helping us to co-create and design a conference program that recognizes both the significant challenge and promise of the current economic moment. Each of our partners understands that long-term solutions to strengthen upward mobility can only be created when we break down silos across our various organizations, our sectors, and when we think of innovative approaches. So I want to take a moment to recognize and express our immense gratitude to our partners, including AARP, the Business Roundtable, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Jobs for the Future, Families and Workers Fund, and Rework America Alliance, a Marco Foundation initiative. Each of our partners is tackling the economic mobility question with a distinctive focus and a distinctive agenda. You'll hear from leaders from our partner organizations throughout the conference program. So I also want to extend my deepest thanks to our funders, particularly our founding funders and co-chairs of WorkRise Funders Advisory Committee of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. You can find a full list of our many funders, partners on our website, and we're grateful to them all. And now, without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our opening speaker, Shamina Singh. Now, in addition to serving as the founder and president of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, Shamina is also the executive vice president for sustainability at MasterCard. For more than 20 years, Shamina has been on the front lines of developing and implementing solutions to make the global economy work for everyone. In her role as center president, she leads a team that leverages MasterCard's data, technology, capital, and expertise to achieve social impact. As EVP for sustainability, Shamina is responsible for implementing ESG initiatives across the company. It's my pleasure to welcome Shamina Singh to our Zoom. And I'll note for the audience that this segment has been previously recorded. Welcome, Shamina.
Welcome to WorkRise's annual conference, Charting a Resilient Future for U.S. Workers. In the past few years, we have seen extraordinary shifts in the labor market. The COVID-19 pandemic changed how and where we work on a massive scale, and the response from the federal government was unprecedented. WorkRise is focused on gathering evidence to support decision makers and leaders to drive change and expand opportunity. Over the next 3 days, you will hear promising ideas and potential solutions from workers, as well as leaders in business, government, and advocacy that can help point the way towards better outcomes for the economy. Each day will focus on a core theme, building upon insights from the day before. Today's program will focus on the current uncertainties faced by workers and business. Tomorrow, we will explore innovation supporting economic mobility in the public and private sectors. And on Thursday, the final day of the conference, our program centers on turning risks into opportunity and building resilience for an uncertain future. At the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, we recognize the importance of a labor economy that works for all. Our investments in the WorkRise platform underscores our commitment to evidence-based policies and programs that empower all workers to thrive. In addition, we recently announced our new investment in Strive USA, a national program that is designed to join together and strengthen an ecosystem of organizations supporting small businesses. As we are all aware, small businesses are a critical pathway to employment, particularly for minority and underserved segments of the population. In today's opening panel, we'll hear more about policies and programs to support small businesses from experts on the subject. Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic, National Urban League President Mark Morial, and Beth Cobert, Acting President of the Markle Foundation. We hope the ideas, lessons, and insights you'll hear over the next 3 days will inspire you to take action to improve the lives of workers and their families. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I'll now turn it back over to Todd.
Thank you, Shamina, for those remarks that really help us set the stage for today. So before I introduce the moderator of our first panel, we want to engage you in a brainstorming exercise. So we're eager to hear your ideas for potential solutions to improve economic mobility of low-wage workers and others who've been excluded from opportunity. So please share your thoughts in the chat on promising policies, programs, or innovative solutions that you think would make a difference. So you'll see in the chat a link that will be capturing that information. So I'd like to now introduce our first panel, which convenes two luminaries from the world of policy and advocacy to reflect on our current economic moment and what it means for workers and families. I'm delighted to introduce the moderator of our first panel, and that's Beth Cobert. Beth currently serves as acting president of the Markle Foundation. Now, in this role, Beth leads the Rework America Alliance, a unique partnership of civil rights organizations, nonprofits, private sector employers, labor unions, educators, and others, working to help people in low-wage roles move into good jobs with opportunities for career advancement. Now, prior to joining the Markle Foundation, Beth enjoyed a long career in the federal government. She served in the Obama administration as the acting director of the Office of Personnel Management and also served as deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget. So Beth, over to you.
All right, got to get the unmute working. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Shamina. And thanks to WorkRise and all of its partners for the opportunity to be here with you today and moderate this conversation with our esteemed guests, Dr. Raphael Bostic and Mark Morial. Raphael Bostic is the 15th President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. In this role, President Bostic is responsible for all the bank's activities, including monetary policy, bank supervision and regulation, and payment services. In addition, he serves on the Federal Reserve's chief monetary policy body, the Federal Open Market Committee. Welcome, Dr. Bostic. Also joining us will be Mark Morial, the president and CEO of the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. Mr. Morial served as the mayor of New Orleans for 8 years and is past president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Mark is a leading voice in the movement for jobs, education, housing, and voting rights. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
And I just want to add that the Markle Foundation, and specifically our Rework America Alliance, counts both the Atlanta Fed and the National Urban League as trusted and core partners in our work supporting efforts to create pathways for opportunities from low-wage workers to move into higher-wage, high-quality jobs. And it's truly an honor to be sharing that partnership with them and a real thrill to be on this Zoom with them today. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Beth.
Great. I want to start with the big picture. As we're seeing, there's sort of two dynamics weighing heavily on the mind of everyone today: inflation and wages. On the one hand, the labor markets has looked tight, lots of demand for workers, relatively low unemployment, which has led to some increases in wages, particularly for workers earning at the lower wage scale. On the other hand, inflation's been running at 4-decade highs, and the Fed's taken steps to curb inflation by raising interest rates, which does come at some risk of higher unemployment, particularly for low-wage workers. And so I'll pose this question to each of you, and Raphael, I'll start with you. What is really happening on balance today for low-wage workers, and how do low-wage workers fit into the way you're thinking about monetary policy decisions? And Mark will then turn to you and talk about its implications for National Urban League programming. So Raphael, over to you.
Well, thanks, Beth. And I wanted to just say hello to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a true privilege and honor to be part of the kickoff panel of this great program. You know, Todd Green gave a lot of introductory comments for the WorkRise program. I've known Todd for quite a long time, and it's really no surprise that this program is as strong as it is. And again, it's just great to be able to be a part of it. Now, to your question about what's happening with lower income workers, I think the top line message that is front forward for me is that inflation is high. And in fact, it's too high, and we need to get that under control. And until we do, it's going to be a real challenge for all Americans, but particularly for lower income Americans, because every dollar is not going to go as far as it has in the past. And for lower income Americans, every dollar is actually more precious because it is essential to get the necessities of food, of shelter, of clothing, and of healthcare that all Americans need. So when we have a very high inflationary situation, it's going to be very difficult for lower income and low wage workers. Now, the other thing I would say, I do hear a lot of people who have concerns about Federal Reserve policy and trying to get inflation under control. My response and my thought on that is that without stable prices, it's hard to imagine that we're going to get the economy into a long-run growth trajectory. And the reason for this is that in order to get on that long-run trajectory, you've got to have businesses willing to make plans and invest so that they're in a more productive space in the future. You've got to have families and people being willing to invest in getting human capital and have faith that when they get their degrees and when they get those skills, there will be jobs there for them to fill. And when we have a high inflationary environment, what winds up happening is that the psychology of producers changes and the psychology of individuals and families change, such that they focus much more on the short run, making sure they can get through today and to tomorrow, and much less on those investments that will get us onto a longer run trajectory. So we've got to get stable prices under control. And if we do that, then in the long run, we will be much better off. And let me just say one other thing on this, which is that the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. Now, I've talked a lot about stable prices, but we also have a mandate of maximum employment. And if we do not get this economy on a stable long-run trajectory, it's going to be hard for us to achieve a maximum employment that includes as many Americans as possible. And I'll just tell you, here in Atlanta, our bank has a tagline, an economy that works for everyone. That's our goal, and that's where we're trying to get to. So we must get this economy back on that long-run trajectory, which means getting inflation under control. So even though there may be some short-run pain, it should lead to long-run significant gain.
Thanks, Raphael. Mark, we want to turn it over to you and get your perspective on where we are today, its implications for National Urban League, its programming, and how you're thinking about these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I appreciate you, Beth, and congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Bostic, continuing pride in your success and your voice at the Atlanta Fed. I'd like to step back a bit and maybe level set on where we are by remembering the last 3 years. We went through a period where the economy was generally on a steady growth path and unemployment was trending down. Then we had the shock to the system of a global pandemic, unprecedented in that it touched every single continent on this globe with the exception of Antarctica, and forced shutdowns, slowdowns, and disruptions on an unprecedented scale. Every supply chain, much of the economy was slowed or screeched to a halt. In this nation, the federal government stepped up with both aggressive fiscal and monetary interventions to try to avert a calamitous catastrophe. And it did a number of things which were necessary and needed. And I ask those who criticize what they did, suppose they had done nothing. Would we be in a depression for a decade or two of a nature and of a magnitude greater than the Great Depression? So our government stepped up. There were checks, there were loans, there were bailouts, there was stimulus for government on an unprecedented scale. And it certainly allowed many Americans to withstand the tremendous shock of what the global pandemic created for all of us. But it also enabled, I believe, when the global pandemic began to ease and the economy began to open, a rapid reduction in unemployment, a rapid re-employment of millions and millions of Americans. Indeed, the fastest post-recession recovery in modern economic times. One of the downsides to this has been that now we have inflation that was unforeseen or unpredicted, or if predicted, not predicted on a scale and magnitude that we have. But it is important to recognize that right now we have generally, against historic trends, lower unemployment than we've generally faced, although we still have the 2-to-1 black-white differential, which is troubling to me, but that we've had this very, very, very fast return. While steps by the Fed to stabilize prices are welcome, needed, and necessary, I also want to throw up a cautionary note that unemployment and joblessness amongst Americans should not be the weapon of choice to tame, if you will, the inflation in the economy, because what that might result in is a period of stagflation. Because even though the Fed has taken assertive action, that assertive action does not seem to have impacted the inflation rate, which leads questions to whether what we're seeing is attributable to factors beyond the American economy. International supply chain, shutdowns in China, where 1/3 of all world manufacturing indeed takes place. In the energy markets, not only do you have economic factors, you have political factors. Owing to the battle of the new, if you will, tension between Russia and the United States. You have disruptions in the food market due to the war in Ukraine. These are factors not easily impacted by traditional American monetary policy. So I want to make these observations because I think they're important to make, to understand while I am greatly concerned about the inflation and its impact on working people, I do not think it should be looked at in isolation from the fact that we have had a strong recovery from the global economic downturn brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, we are in uncharted waters when it comes to the ability of our policies, whether it's fiscal or monetary policies, to impact, if you will, the type of inflation we see. Having said that, I would also query whether the Fed should re-examine whether its 2% benchmark inflation rate is right for these times. Because while we've had an economy for many, many decades that's not had severe inflation, we've had depressed wages, so we haven't had wage inflation. And we've had price inflation greater than wage inflation. The result has been the exacerbation of, if you will, income inequality in the country. So I may raise more questions than I offer answers, but I listen to the policymakers and the commentators on television all the time. And sometimes I quite candidly believe that their analysis is too present tense. It doesn't look at the factors that brought us to where we are, nor do they understand fully the fact that we're in unique, uncharted territory because of the nature of the geopolitical circumstances that we face. So I'll rest there.
Thank you, Mark. And certainly the complexity of the last few years is something that all of us have experienced in so many different forms. And Raphael, I want to take that and sort of reflect on your comment earlier about the theme for the Atlanta Fed of an economy that works for everyone, right? And you've talked in the past as well how it is individuals with the lowest incomes, those without 4 years college degrees, Black and Hispanic workers who see the greatest benefits from strong labor markets. And so I'd love to get your context on how, in thinking of this, an economy that works for everyone, why that happens and how that plays out, and what are the implications of those learnings for what we're seeing today?
So thank you, Beth. That's that's a very big question. There have been volumes written
you
on
got
this.
big answers.
But we'll see. We'll see. I hope I have some answers that can at least start to unpack some of the issues here. Look, the first thing that we ask is, if you're trying to get an economy that works for everyone, like, who is the economy not working for? And in that context, one of the things that we do is we look to where there are disparities, where there are disparities in incomes, where there are disparities in unemployment rates, where there are disparities in wealth, and where there are disparities in wages. And we know in all of these instances, lower income people struggle more, people without college degrees struggle more, women often struggle more, And so this is an area where there is a lot to understand and appreciate. When I think about sort of why it is that that lower income workers are facing so much pressure, and actually they face pressure in good times and in bad times. Like this is actually a very good time. We have, as Mark noted, historically low unemployment. We have people that at the lower end in particular who are seeing their wages increase faster than they have for many, many years. But at the same time, they are feeling pressures. And so why is that? I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that there's an information gap such that there may be opportunities that are out there, but people who have not, or who are in communities or whose families have not had a long history of being attached to labor markets, they're not in those networks. They may never hear about the things that are going on. And that is a really significant challenge. Now, a second reason why there's pressure is around automation. Now, we always, through the course of human history, there's always been technology that's been introduced that's disrupted how we produce our goods, going way back to, you could think about the wheel or the printing press or the steam engine. And what typically happens with technology is that technology first comes in and it disrupts those tasks that are easily replicated, those that don't require high levels of technical skills. And in many instances, lower wage workers are doing those sorts of jobs. And so they are vulnerable to technological disruption. And in today's environment, where I talk to employers all the time, one of the things that they tell me is that they're having a hard time finding workers to fill slots, and particularly entry-level workers. So they're now thinking about introducing technology to fill that, so they don't need workers in that space nearly as much. Now, a third reason why I think there's pressure is that there's, in many instances, as businesses think about how to invest, they want to invest in their productive technology. They want to get that figured out. They want to get it placed in a good place. That really requires hiring some technical people who can do logistics, who can figure all that stuff out. And it's only after things are perfected that they then turn to fill in the worker class to actually execute those strategies. And so in many business cycles, that just takes a long time. And too often in our history, by the time many employers have figured that out, the business cycle is turning. And we get to a place where the lower income workers do not get to enjoy the full fruits of those investments. And one of the things that was very interesting, just leading up to the pandemic, we were having a historically long growth period. We were seeing unemployment rates go down in groups that we had not really seen that before. And it was precisely because the cycle lasted longer. Those investments had an opportunity to play out. And so people who had typically been on the sidelines ready to jump in and then things turn actually had a chance to jump in. I think there's a real opportunity and possibility for that reality to continue and for us to get back to a place where we have long cycles, where investments get to be fully realized, and where Americans of all stripes get to be fully productive and have work that they want, that pays them good wages so they don't have to have multiple jobs. Let me say two other things, because Mark raised a couple of issues that I think are really important. The first is, why do we have this inflation and what can the Fed do about it? I would say Mark is exactly right. The Fed it can't solve all the problems that have led to the challenges of inflation. In particular, we have this imbalance between demand, which is up here, and supply, which is down here. Our policies don't do a lot in the short run to address supply. We've got to have the supply chains at the port ease. We need to have more chips coming and those sorts of things. But we also need to be mindful that there are two levers, and we've got to see to what, if supply moves more, then demand can move down less, and then we actually have to do less as the Federal Reserve. So that's a perspective that I think about a lot. And then the last thing I would just say is that there is a ton of complexity and uncertainty in today's marketplace. The pandemic caused a lot of people to step back and ask, why am I happy? Not why, but am I happy working the way I used to work pre-pandemic? And many workers, including a lot of low-income workers, are saying, well, not really. And they're starting to think about, are there other opportunities out there? And the competitive marketplace has changed a lot. We know that outfits like Target, Walmart, many of the banks, now their minimum wages are in the $20 to $25 an hour range, where a lot of low-income, low-wage workers were working in the $7 to $12 range. So there's a lot of shuffle and churn that's going on that's creating a lot of tension and disequilibrium in the marketplace. And we've got to work through all that if we're going to get to a stable place where the economy is really working for all families as well as all businesses.
Thanks, Raphael. You talked about sort of changing mindsets and attitudes and where we are today. And Mark, I know the National Urban League recently conducted a survey, the Pulse of Black America survey, and that captures the experiences and aspirations of Black Americans in this current moment. And there were some areas of optimism and some areas of challenges about inequities that persist. So, for example, more than half of Black Americans said that a lack of access to quality jobs is a major factor holding people of color back. Maybe you can reflect on that and one or two other findings that paint for you important takeaways for where we are today and what are the implications for the kinds of actions we can be taking to close gaps in employment and wealth and other important areas.
Hey, thanks, Beth. Thanks for that. Yes, as a part of our State of Black America, we did conduct a survey or a poll, the Pulse of Black America. I think what was striking is many Black Americans believing that, quote unquote, I've done what it was suggested that I do. I finished high school. I went to community college or four-year college or even the military. Yet, I still have a difficult time getting the job of my choice. I still, if I have the job, feel like I'm not promoted up the ladder on an equal basis. It's the idea that I follow the rules, but I still can't get ahead. This feeling and notion by many Black Americans is supported by surveys that suggest that a white person with a high school diploma is more likely to get called back for a second interview than a Black person with a master's degree or a PhD for a similar type of job. So there's a sense here that some 60 years after the civil rights days, that this lingering discrimination and exclusion, this implicit bias, sometimes not easily, if you will, recognized, is still ever present in people's ability to move up the economic ladder, accumulate wealth, enjoy and find the quality of life. Now, this is what punched through in the poll by many and by so many. And one of the things that we work hard to do every day is to defeat the stereotype that all African Americans have not finished high school, or even to defeat the stereotype that a majority of African Americans have not finished high school, or to defeat the stereotype that there's not an abundant pool of African American workers out there who have finished four-year universities, who finished community colleges, who finished technical schools, who've been honorably discharged from the military and are as qualified, ready, willing, and able as anyone else for jobs in every sector of the American economy. That punched through the idea that we still don't have broad range access to quality jobs. And the idea that there's as though there's this invisible hand holding people back. What say me is that those who make economic policy, those business leaders in America, I think the spirit of the Markle Initiative, Beth, that we're all involved in, is the idea that if we provide full economic opportunity to everyone in this nation, that the overall benefit will inure to everyone in this nation. And that's the spirit and the theory behind the work we're all trying to do when it comes to upskilling. But we shouldn't believe that it's a simple skills problem, and this is what the polling shows alone. It's still workplace attitudes. It's still mismatches in geography. There's still a lot of complex factors that many African Americans feel hold them back. Now, this is one of the reasons why, and Dr. Bostic, Raphael alluded to this, some people, and this has been, I think, noticeable in the Black community, have stepped back and saying, I'm not going back to that job. I'm not going back to waiting tables. I'm not going back to a low wage opportunity. I'm going to take a stake and try to do something else. I'm going to try to become an entrepreneur. I'm going to go work in a small business. I'm going to go and pursue my dream. So while some people want to paint the picture that some people don't want to work, the fact is they want to do other work. They want to pivot to new opportunities. For example, amongst African American women, I've noticed a surge in entrepreneurial spirit and activity. I've noticed some people deciding that they're going to take a shot to completely change how they work and where they work. And the pandemic may have compelled some people to follow their dreams, to take some risks that they would not otherwise been able to take. So that's a broad perspective on what our polling is showing, that the spirit and the energy is there, but sometimes people feel beat down and defeated in the traditional workplace. And now, because of the pandemic, may say there are other options I want to take, other avenues I want to pursue, and maybe risks I'm willing to take.
So Mark, you talked about a number of things that are changing, and you talked about entrepreneurialism, and I want to shift gears for a minute, talk about a piece of the economy that is vital, both in terms of entrepreneurship and opportunity. Talk about small business for a minute. Shamina teamed this up in the introductions. Small businesses, drivers of economic growth, the builders of wealth. As you know, right, companies with less than 500 employees together employ about half of the private sector workforce and are critical areas of opportunity and growth. Want to get the take from both of you about what, in this time of change and uncertainty and complexity that we've all noted, and changing attitudes and dynamics, how do we think about supporting and helping small businesses and mid-sized opportunities to ensure that they've got what they need to grow and thrive and create good jobs that will provide opportunities to everyone across the board? Raphael, I'll start with you on that one.
So, thanks, Beth. And it's really interesting when Mark was talking about stereotypes, the stereotype I wrote down that he hadn't said initially was people don't want to work. And I think people really do want to work, and they just want to be given a shot to do their best work. And if they can accomplish that, we'll all be good. Mark also noted that in this pandemic period, we've seen a spike in entrepreneurship. This is across the board. In our bank, we have some economists who have done some research to suggest that the pandemic has triggered like a tsunami of new businesses into the marketplace. And I think in part it's because there was this feeling that, maybe there are other ways to make a living that lead to higher quality of life, and that's really important. When I think about small businesses and minority small businesses in particular, there are really three things that come to mind. The first is access to capital. Now, one of the things that we know is that for small business creation and formation, typically that is generated by either the wealth of the small business entrepreneur or by the wealth of their family and friends. So it's really wealth-based and it's personal wealth-based. But on the other hand, we also know that in minority neighborhoods, families don't have wealth. There's not a lot of wealth there. That's a long-standing historical reality. I think the median African-American family has something like 1/10 or 1/8 the wealth of a median white family. And that just means there's less capital that's available to do entrepreneurship, to run a small business, and to ultimately get it to scale. Because ultimately what we want is these businesses to really employ others and become a base of well-being and opportunity for a large number of people. That's actually a real problem. In Atlanta, for example, the vast majority of minority-owned businesses are single proprietorships. So they have one employee or maybe two employees. If it's one employee, it's the owner. and maybe they have one other person. And that's not a scale that really starts to give deeply into the community and become a foundation for things. So we got to deal with that. A second thing that I've really thought about a lot in our bank and for businesses in Atlanta is for them to really think about who are they giving access to the opportunity to work for them. We call it in our system supplier diversity, but thinking about are our processes, are the questions we're asking inhibiting or preventing viable businesses with owners who are minorities and women from actually being able to compete. Now, we're not looking for a less quality product, but we just need to make sure that we're making ourselves available to anyone who can actually do the work. And there are a lot of internal policies and processes that don't allow that to happen. And we've been really working with businesses to make sure they understand what we're doing, but also that we understand what they're doing so that there's not a mismatch in communication across this. And then the third thing that I would point to is really networks of mentors and peers who can create a learning environment and a nurturing environment such that businesses have people to bounce ideas off of, so that they can learn lessons without actually having to go through them and avoid some of the pitfalls that have befallen businesses before. And here, again, there are a number of innovative things that are happening that I think are really interesting. And particularly here in Atlanta, the introduction and the start of a couple of business incubators to really try to create these networks where people are all together and being able to learn. There are also some venture capital funds that are starting to be developed to try to provide some patient equity capital, which is a really special type of capital that allows businesses to really hone their production strategy and be more successful. If we can get more of those sorts of things in place, that will broaden the foundation that will allow a lot more businesses to be established, to grow, and then ultimately to thrive into pillars of minority communities across this country.
Thanks, Raphael. I think those themes about capital, supplier diversity, networks are all critical, as you've discussed. Mark, I wonder about your thoughts around sort of the theme of small business and opportunity creation.
So one thing I'm excited to share, and let me endorse, second, amen, and affirm everything Raphael said, because I think he covered all of the key points. I would point out that I'm excited that the National Urban League has just relaunched its Urban Empowerment Fund, which is our CDFI, our Community Development Financial Institution, and our board of our UEF will meet in the next few days to approve about a half a dozen loans in the neighborhood of probably $50,000 to $125,000, which will inject capital into small businesses. I lift that up because the CDFI is a mechanism through which capital can be injected into small businesses. Invariably, as the banking sector has grown bigger, matured, consolidated, and concentrated, the interest in large banks, even medium-sized banks, or in small banks having the capability to make loans of that level, 500, 100, 150, 250, to small businesses, and particularly minority small, has waned. So the Community Development Financial Institution is a mechanism. And I encourage those who are concerned about access to capital to think about the role that the CDFIs can play in injecting capital and in lending to businesses of that sort. But secondarily, there's been a bit more interest since the murder of George Floyd, and sort of the new awareness about racial justice in this country and economic opportunity, for there to be interest in more risk capital, more funds that are, if you will, making risk capital available, equity capital available to Black small businesses and small businesses across the board. All of these things are positive. We need to not only do it, We need to do more of it. And we need to do it on a more sustainable basis. If you took 15 million small businesses in America and said, would one of those three just hire one more person? Be 5 million more jobs in this country. This is where we can scale this economy. This is where we can create new economic opportunity. I think the thing is we have to embrace new approaches, new methods, new ways, and we have to divorce ourselves of old stereotypes, which were based purely on connections, not capabilities, to build and grow these small businesses. So the National Urban League, we've, on one hand, relaunched our CDFI. On the other hand, we have an initiative with PepsiCo where we've injected equity grants into Black-owned restaurants in 10 cities that had been either shut down or mostly shut down due to COVID. So these are steps, more of which need to be taken.
Really helpful to hear about that perspective, and Mark, the things that the National Urban League is doing, and Raphael, some of the things that are going on in Atlanta and beyond with the Fed's leadership to create these opportunities. We're getting closer to the end here, so I want to make sure we get to a couple of points as we go forward. You've all talked about the issues that we're facing today in this complicated economy, and the importance of really moving towards an economy that, again, I'll go back to the phrase, that works for everyone and creates that equitable opportunity. I'd love for each of you, and Raphael, we can maybe start with you again, just what does that economy look like to you, and what are one or two things that you're engaged in today, programs or initiatives, bold, that you think are really helping to make a difference? And I'd love you to call those out for the folks who are here on the call, because I know the call is filled with people who want to take action, and they want to hear about the kind of actions that each of you are helping to lead and to sponsor for others. So the vision and one or two actions that you think are going to help get us there. And then Mark, we'll turn that over to you.
Well, happy to do that, Beth. When I think of an economy that works for everyone, I define that as an economy where anyone who wants to work can find a job that pays them a wage that meets their productive capacity. And there are really three pieces to that I think are really important. One, that we're trying to get people to their greatest potential. So they've got to be able to get the skills and the talents and have access to the opportunities that are going to allow them to fulfill that potential. So we need an infrastructure of skill building so that people can really be sharp and equipped to function. The second thing is that they got to be able to find the work. So that means you need to have networks, you need to have information, you need to have the economy be an open economy so people can find the things that are out there. And then the third thing is that you've got to have employers that allow people to work. You've got to have employers who are willing to say, look, I'm going to take the person who is most qualified, who has the skills, and actually I should say this, who have the skills to do the job, as opposed to just looking at some paper qualifications, because we know that in many instances, businesses will use a college degree as a qualification, even though for many jobs, you don't need to have a college degree to have the skills to fulfill those jobs. So we're really emphasizing that employers really try to move to a skills-based assessment of what's required to the job, and then put the skills up there. And I think they will find that there are many more workers that can qualify and meet the requirements. In terms of specific things, Beth, you mentioned this at the very beginning, the Rework America Alliance that the three of us are working in, it comes up all the time as I go around the 6th District. People are hungry for a mature, well-functioning workforce development infrastructure that allows people to have confidence that when they get the skills, there are going to be jobs that are there for them, that are going to pay them good wages, and that will endure. And the work that we're doing here is fantastic. I would also call out something that's happening in Atlanta. The Metro Chamber of Commerce here has an initiative called the Atlanta Action for Racial Equity initiative, where we're asking businesses to really look at their own policies and programs and to make an assessment about whether there are things they can do to change them that actually enhance access to the wider population, that increase equity in their companies and across the region. And we have playbooks online here in Atlanta that everyone can access. So I would encourage folks to do that for supplier diversity, for education and the like. And then the last thing I would also say here is, we are doing things to try to get as much information out into the marketplace as possible in Atlanta. So the Atlanta Fed has things called an Opportunity Occupations Monitor, which lists at a county level the jobs that are going to be most plentiful that don't require a 4-year degree. We want everyone to see those things and go out and use them and make people know that these opportunities are available. We have a program called Advancing Careers for low-income workers. And this is another area where we're trying to have conversations about, can we set up an incentive structure so that people can improve themselves and have an incentive to get more skills and more training and move up the wage ladder because they are more talented and more skilled, such that they never need to be on welfare or public support again. These are things that are really exciting. I think that they really have the potential to be game changers for millions of Americans, and I would encourage all of you to take a look at those things and join us if you can.
Thank you, Raphael. And I will work with the WorkRise folks to make sure that the folks who are here today can find their way to those resources. And I love the focus that you and your whole team puts on being practical when you do these things, right? If it's a good idea and you can't turn it into an opportunity for an employer to connect with a worker and get that person to a good job, then it isn't enough. And so I love that focus on practicality. Mark, I want to turn to you. Your vision for what success here looks like, and the couple of things that you see going on at the National Urban League that get you excited about the more we can do to get closer to that vision we'd like to get to.
At the National Urban League, one of our 5 goals is a goal which says every American with access to a quality job that pays a living wage with good benefits. And fundamentally, that's an overall goal when it comes to jobs, workforce, and the economy. I would secondly say to those is that we do a very large suite of programs around economic empowerment, from job training to home buyer education to entrepreneurship counseling programs. And for those who might be interested, I would recommend them to go to the National Urban League's website at nul.org to find out a little bit more and to follow our conversation across social media at Nat Urban League, where we talk about this work on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook all the time. Let me just highlight a few things which I think are of note. Currently, we're doing some very important work in the re-entry space, working with returning citizens to get them back in the workforce in now over 10 cities across the land. And that work is special to us because one of the things many will find is the enormous talent in the community of those who spend time behind bars and the great potential that many have when they return if we nurture it and if we invest in it. So I want to lift up that element of workforce, the reentry work that we do. The second I'd like to lift up is certainly the entrepreneurship work that we're doing. We're able to expand that work dramatically due to a relationship with the Small Business Administration and the Biden-Harris administration, which decided one of the things that was necessary in the American Rescue Plan was to invest more greatly in the infrastructure that supports small business growth and development, with a particular focus on Black and brown businesses. So we're doing work providing free services to business owners in some 25 plus cities across America. Prior to this relationship, it was a little bit about a dozen. So we've been able to double the work that we're doing in that space. The third thing I'd point out is what I call an action project. We are building a mixed-use development in Harlem. Our lead developer is African American. If you walk the site and see who's working on the project, you're going to see Blacks, whites, Asians, people of Latino heritage. You're going to see men and you're going to see women as construction forepersons, as construction workers, working at that site, and you're going to see a record number of, if you will, minority business enterprises. What will be there? 17 stories, 170 units of all affordable housing, the National Urban League's headquarters, New York's first ever civil rights museum, and retail establishments that will produce quality job opportunities for the people of Harlem. So we are, I call it poetry in motion with this project. We are practicing what we preached. We've imagined and executed what we dream about and aspire to. And I point that out because in a place like Harlem, when there's been a tremendous amount of conversation about redlining and gentrification, this project runs counter to that. So it's a project of disruption. It's a project of imagination, but it is an example of the broad array of work that we do at the National Urban League on the very issues we're all talking about today.
So, Mark, I'm looking forward to seeing that and coming to a meeting there sometime soon when we actually
We'll host it. Yeah, we'll
person
be
again.
finished in about 2 years.
That'll be fine. I think we'll still be working on these issues in 2 years. But I know that I want to thank Mark and Raphael for their insights. You can see, even through the Zoom room, the passion they bring to these issues about getting an economy to work, getting equity to be part of that, and the benefits that accrue to everyone when we make that happen. And the energy they bring to saying, what is it we can be doing now in a world of complicated context to make a difference? So thank you both for your contributions here today. And thank you for all the work that you do with us through the We Work America Alliance, through the many partners that you support and the many communities where people every day can feel the difference that you're making.
Thanks,
With that,
Beth.
and a big thanks
Beth.
to WorkRise.
Thanks, Raphael, always.
Good to see you.
I also want to thank WorkRise for bringing this group together. And next, I'd like to turn to introducing the moderator of our next panel, Kim Brown. Kim is a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she helps drive the strategy for economic mobility and opportunity initiative. For more than 15 years, Kim has worked on initiatives promoting economic mobility through education, workforce development, and philanthropy. She serves on WorkRise Funders Advisory Committee, advising WorkRise's leadership on grant making, strategy, and programs. Kim, welcome to the Zoom and to the great program we've got underway here.
All right, thanks, Beth, for the welcome and the introduction. And we're going to pivot now and get into the research as well as some perspectives from practitioners in human services and economic development on some of the fascinating labor market trends that we're seeing today, and really get into what these trends mean for workers' long-term economic prospects. So today I'm joined by an amazing group of panelists from very diverse viewpoints. We've got Julian D. Miller, who's the co-founding director of the Reuben B. Anderson Institute for Social Justice at Tougaloo College, which is a private historically Black college in Mississippi. Julian is also an assistant professor at the school as well of political science. We've got today Sarah Miller, a principal advisor at the Center for Workforce and Economic Opportunity of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Jake Rosenfeld, who's a professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. And finally, Tracy Evans, who's the president and CEO of the American Public Human Services Association, and also a member of the WorkRise Leadership Board. So let's just get into it. I'm going to start by asking each of you to reflect on the current economic moment. So right now, the economy is throwing off some really mixed signals. September's job report suggested a strong job market, but also signs of slower job growth and fewer folks quitting their jobs. Inflation continues to be an issue despite efforts by the Fed to control it by raising interest rates. In August, prices were over 8% higher than they were last summer. Wages for jobs at the bottom of the earnings ladder have grown, yet inflation is hitting family budgets really hard. So with all that in mind, I'd like each of you to reflect on this current economic moment and think about what it means for workers' long-term economic mobility. And so we'll start with Sarah and then move on to Jake, Julian, and we'll finish up with you on this reflection, Tracy, if that works. So Jake, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. And thanks for WorkRise for including me in this important discussion. So these are challenging questions. I wanted to start with a very brief working definition of worker power. And this is drawn from a WorkRise report on the issue that we recently co-authored with Ioana Marinescu. And so you can think of worker power and the kind of potential for upward mobility along two dimensions. First, it's the exit dimension of worker power, which describes a worker's opportunity to leave one's current job for a better option. And second, we have the voice dimension. And that describes workers' ability to exercise their voice in the workplace, opportunities to provide input on working conditions, on firm decisions. And voice is often exercised through worker organizations, thinking here of labor unions and other union-like groups. And what we really saw over the last couple of years is a dramatic expansion of worker power across both of these dimensions. First, we have the Great Resignation, I think, which more accurately should have been referred to as the Great Job Hop, right? Quit rates were through the roof, but so were new hire rates. Employers were gobbling up workers as workers job shopped by the millions. And workers were exercising their power by leaving low-road employers in droves and accepting new jobs with higher pay and often better benefits. And then we've had story after story of new organizing successes within workplaces, the voice dimension of power, right? We've had over 200 Starbucks. We had the first Amazon warehouse. We had my favorite, a medieval reenactment center in New Jersey, all voting to unionize in the types of workplaces that were long written off by many as unorganizable, as places where unions would never establish a foothold. So that was workers demanding better pay and working conditions through exercising their voice at work. And now the crucial question is how much of this is going to last as the labor market loosens, as inflation rises, and as the Fed takes steps to combat it, and as predictably unemployment ticks up, right? And I think here there is cause for concern. So much of rising worker power, and we have kind of great fresh new research establishing this, so much of the rise of worker power over the past few years rested on historically low unemployment. And so many of the gains that were made remain fragile. Are as of yet not all that durable. You can look at those unionization successes. Vanishingly few of them have translated into contracts that would kind of solidify those instances of worker voice into long-term gains. And rising unemployment inevitably means fewer outside options for workers to jump to when looking to move up economically. So I think there are real reasons to be quite worried about the near-term road ahead.
Great, thanks. And I said I was going to start with Sarah, and I went right to you, Jake. So sorry about that. But let's go back to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And thanks, Jake. I agree with the concern that you hold in this moment and what's going to happen when the labor market does soften. I just want to kind of couch some of my comments inside of a current research project that we're leading here at the Fed to talk directly with workers. I think this has been kind of a rise since the beginning of the pandemic to really integrate worker voice, as you talked about, into how we think about policy and programs, because too often their voice is absent, that conversation, which was why it was important for the Fed to move into this direction. Traditionally, our economic understanding is influenced by what we hear from businesses, small and large, and staffing agencies and community-based organizations. So what we understand about barriers that low and moderate income workers, especially those without a bachelor's degree, are experiencing in the labor market are largely inferred from voices that have agendas that may come into the conversation with a certain bias that workers don't want to participate in the labor market. They don't have the right skills. They're not motivated, as you heard from the comments earlier with Dr. Bostic and Mark Morial. So we wanted to start to have these conversations and really understand what has been affecting these workers' ability to participate in the labor market, how their priorities may have shifted, and how they are navigating the current moment. We're still in the midst of this. I would say any of my comments right now are very preliminary and just reflect my interaction with some conversations as we're heavily coding all of the work right now, and we'll produce the final piece in early 2023. But I'm hearing a lot of things that have kind of rebutted what we've heard at a national level. Workers absolutely do want to work, but the workers that we're talking to, that sub-baccalaureate coming from essential sectors, are not necessarily benefiting from the power that you might expect or hope that they have in this moment. We're hearing quite a bit that workers are applying to jobs, dozens, if not hundreds of jobs, not hearing back. They're seeing changes in a job description that maybe no longer will require a bachelor's degree or certain years of experience, but then are told that they're not moving forward in a candidacy because they don't have that very degree or years of experience that were just stripped from that job description. We heard quite a bit that unemployment, extended unemployment, stimulus, tax credits were in fact not a disincentive to work. They just allowed them to catch up on 1 to 2 bills. And as one participant said, take a breath and really think about what they wanted. So I agree that this is kind of not necessarily a great resignation, especially for the workers that we're talking to, because they have to work. They are actively looking to better themselves and get into higher quality jobs. It's more of a reevaluation. What do they want? What are they prioritizing? And as Mark said earlier, what kind of risk are they willing to take to put themselves into better footing and have some economic stability in the long term while being economically mobile in the near term?
Great, thanks. Julia, let's get your take.
Thank you, Kimberly. So I think, again, I guess ditto to everything everyone else has said. I think that 2 things from a national perspective. I think the problem is that while we've had this amazing groundswell of union activity and labor activity, the problem is it hasn't been followed up with a policy response that actually operationalizes and legalizes protections for unions, so it can be there can be greater proliferation of unions. Because we know that if you go back to from the end of World War II into the early 1970s, I mean, living standards essentially were doubled from that period of time, because at that time we had, as at its peak, about 36% of our private sector workforce were unionized in like the 50s, and then it went down to about a quarter of our labor force in the early 70s. Well, now we're at a point where it's less than 7% of our private sector workforce is unionized, and so we know that the unionization that took place post New Deal, there was this groundswell of uprising from labor unions, and then of course in 1935 we had the National Labor Relations Act. Well, we sort of lost this opportunity to respond and legalize those protections from a policy standpoint at this point, because we're about to face a midterm election in a few weeks, and whatever happens, we know we're not going to necessarily probably have a majority that will be supportive of those labor protections, and that's essentially what's going to be crucial to ultimately empowering workers, giving them real power where they can sort of challenge this monopoly that the private sector has on living wage employment. And I'm from Mississippi, of course, but the Anderson Institute, we do economic justice work in Mississippi, and what we've heard from the workers there is what we've been hearing for decades, because in Mississippi 53% of our workforce is low income. So that's about 1.5 million people. 67% are Black, 40% are white. And in Mississippi, you have to work 82 hours just a week just to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And so we have and the only time Mississippi, since they found the statistic for the poverty rates per capita, the only time we were not the poorest state in the country was in 2006. I think when Louisiana started post-Katrina in 2006, and of course 2007 we took it back. So it's a structural problem that we deal with, where there are just there is no worker power. The workers in Mississippi are the least powerful workers in the United States, and even with the great resignation, still it was not enough in order to really tighten the labor market and move wages in an upward direction in a way that can really empower workers. And certainly there was no policy supports. So a lot of our work at the Anderson Institute and with our economic justice work has been focused around how do we challenge this monopoly, the private sector has, both in the short term, trying to raise wages to be able to, for people to have a living wage, but also in the long term, thinking about how do we democratize our economy, in a way so low-income workers, particularly, especially workers of color, can be able to capture more wealth. They're not beholden to existing corporations because our educational system is not adequate enough for our citizens to compete for those types of jobs. One, and again, it's just that we're not getting the investment in the area. So how do we begin to sort of democratize economic development in a way so workers can become owners and capture wealth and not be beholden to the private sector?
All right, thank you. And Tracy, want to round that out?
Yeah, thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here and with such great fellow panelists. As I was listening to everybody, I was thinking, it's really a pivotal time that we're in right now. We have an opportunity to bridge to longer term upward mobility for workers, building on the recent investments that were made throughout the pandemic and the systemic changes I think that it really has sparked. But it remains fragile, which is a word I'd written down, and I noticed that Jake used it as well. It's really a fragile time for low-wage workers and their families, even with the gains that have been made. The stressors that continue to weigh down on families, as we've heard from all of the panelists, there's a lot. And there are structural barriers. I really appreciate Julian's comment about structure. And how difficult some of the structural barriers make it to translate what have been some short-term gains into that longer-term real social and economic mobility for all families. From something as simple as what transportation costs to and from work, gas prices are especially hard hitting on low-wage workers. They can erase the gains that they may have had from increases in wages very quickly. The same is true of food and other staples. We're also, I think, really mindful, this I don't think has come up yet, but we're at a time where the infusion of temporary resources and flexibility and rules that have helped so many families weather the pandemic's economic impact, those are abating or already ended. So things like the end of rental assistance and the eviction moratorium, or child tax credits, or supplemental allotments for SNAP benefits. And when we couple that with structural barriers like the benefits cliff, which is a real dilemma for low-wage workers, when the eligibility for services such as childcare subsidy are no longer available to them because they've earned more, where they're actually having to make decisions and often declining a higher wage job because it essentially means they'll have overall less resources for their family. And I just want to say a shout out to Sarah and her colleagues at the Federal Reserve, because they've done a lot of really great work in helping us understand the impact of the benefits cliff on upward mobility. And I think we have a lot more to unpack in that if we're going to see the really long-term economic mobility gains for families that are at the lower wage earners.
All right, thanks, Tracy. So I'm going to move on, and Jake, bring it back to you. Excuse me. One of the big stories of the year has been what many see as real gains in workers' bargaining power in the labor market. So what are the different dimensions of worker power and voice? How do they shape mobility? And do you think increased bargaining power will last even if we downshift into a period of slower economic growth, if not a recession?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It speaks a lot to what Julian has already shared with us. I think today we got, from the perspective of bargaining power, some disappointing news out of the Albany region, where now the kind of third Amazon warehouse campaign in the last few months was conducted, and the union lost that effort pretty overwhelmingly. So I think they're, combined with the kind of slowdown in new elections at the Starbucks campaign, I think there are rocky roads ahead, and it points to the kind of structural impediments that remain, that we've had these kind of rising up of worker voice over the last couple of years, how they are kind of, and then we've had them confront real structural impediments that haven't changed at the federal or in many state levels. I mean, I hope to get to, and I'm sure we will later in the panel, some reasons for optimism. Right now, though, I think that, this is a kind of hinge point, and it's pretty fragile. And a lot of the optimism that people in the kind of worker organization field felt a year or two ago, 6 months ago, is they're starting to get a bit nervous. There's been this kind of slowdown, both in the broader economic conditions and relatedly in the kind of upsurge of worker organizing that we saw.
That's a shame. Thanks for that, though, Jake. And we will get to some optimism during the panel for sure. Let me go back to you, Sarah. This year, you've been leading an initiative across the Federal Reserve System called the Worker Voice Project, which convenes focus groups of workers to hear about their economic experiences. Everyone who's participating in those groups has either recently changed where and how they work, recently looked for work, or participated in a training program to improve their skills. So why did the Fed view it as important to launch this effort and hear directly from workers? And what have you been learning from those workers through the work you're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And I hope I can offer a little bit of optimism in my answers to both parts of this question. We'll try. So as I mentioned initially, you know, the Fed kind of watches the markets, looks at a lot of data, certainly has a lot of conversations with banks and businesses. Absent that voice and absent that kind of conversation are the workers that we aim to serve every day. You heard, you know, Dr. Bostic, the president of my Fed, talk about how our tagline is an economy that works for all. Well, how do we make sure that it's working for all if we're not talking with the people that all of these decisions affect? So we're hopeful that these types of conversations will influence not just our research and our engagement agenda, but also how we think about broader monetary policy and how we round out really understanding what do current economic conditions look like, especially for those that are getting hit hardest and fastest with inflation and that are, you know, hopefully benefiting from full employment, but as we've been hearing, not necessarily as much as we would like to see. So that's why we're looking at this. And I think we're no different than many of the organizations on the phone that have started, Jake, as you mentioned, over the past couple of years, talking with workers. I think that's a great thing. I'm really excited about this conference as well, because we'll be interspersing worker vignettes into the conversation. So we need, as a field, to do a better job of really integrating their lived experiences. They can be a really good touchstone and a reflection on what is otherwise kind of lagging indicators in the data. In terms of what we're learning, you know, I just want to kind of double down on some of the things that they talked about in the opening panel. You know, people do want to work. They know that they have to build their skills to get to a better place and get to a place that's stable, that doesn't produce any kind of burnout, that really does help to manage their work-life balance, that allows them to feel like they, you know, really have some autonomy and dignity in their job. You know, they need to find work through different kinds of networks. Even through these conversations, I think one of the biggest upshots that we were not necessarily experiencing was the value of the network that these workers got on the focus group itself. Hey, where was that program? Who did you talk to? How did you reach out to this person? So the value of that is just so powerful. And how do we think about broader ways to institutionalize that outside of these more kind of ad hoc and you know, off the cuff conversations? And then certainly, how do we help employers really understand what they're looking for and how they can be more equitable and accessible pathways to economic mobility for these workers? How do we really, you know, change our behavior to get more workers into these roles and hopefully solve some of their labor market crises that they're experiencing right now, and take advantage of this moment in a way that it's going to be systemic and not just cyclical, the way that they would think differently about hiring, differently about upskilling and pulling these workers into the space. So we're learning quite a bit around their experiences and you know, how they're not really able to take advantage of the moment in a way that other people that have the education or at the higher end of the socioeconomic spectrum are able to.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I couldn't agree more about the importance of that worker voice piece. So thanks for sharing some of that work. Tracy, you lead the American Public Human Services Association, as we mentioned at the jump, which represents state and local health and human service agencies across the country. Your members are serving families through food assistance, rental assistance, and other supports. So what are you hearing from those folks, from the workers and families that you're focused on, about how they're experiencing the economy right now?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Kimberly, and want to I think, double down on a lot of what Sarah just shared, really from worker voice and, really intention of wanting to create the best opportunities for themselves and for families. I think one of the things we hear and have really tried to understand through our network of human service leaders is that workers, many of whom are parents, are both wage earners and caretakers. And so some of the things that families are experiencing right now come back to how best to serve their care for their children and create quality experiences for them and continue to earn wages that provide the right supports. And access to childcare remains a gap for many families, especially those who don't work traditional hours, maybe in service or other retail services and industries. And that is a pain point. And I was just on a call last week with a number of state human service leaders across the country. And they are starting, this is more anecdotal than showing up in our statistics yet, but they are starting to see rising applications for nutrition and economic supports, as many families, some of whom are working multiple jobs, really are struggling with the impact of inflation to stretch their wages. So I think, as Jake said, there is a lot to be concerned about in the moment. And I'll just add, and some optimism, which we'll get to, but I did want to just make a quick note about the conditions of the public sector workforce, particularly, folks who are serving in human services or public health type of positions. The government sector jobs have not recovered like many other industries to the pre-pandemic levels. And public sector jobs in human services, which most people might think of in the social services space, have long been under-resourced. And we are hearing from agencies across the country that their own vacancy rates, the workers who are there to help provide the kind of bridge supports that we're talking about that are so important, are at, in many cases, at record vacancies. One in particular that I know of is at 50% vacancy rate. So think about that, the very time that demand might go up on the system that really is designed to be the cushion for families to help weather up and, when in the inevitable ups and downs that we all have in life, really doesn't have the workforce it needs. So it's another pain point that I think often doesn't get a lot of attention that we also have to be mindful of.
Great, Tracy, thanks for highlighting that. And Julia, let me go to you again. You've been deeply involved in advancing economic justice and community development at the grassroots level in Mississippi. And you're bringing together community leaders and resources to meet the needs and aspirations of people directly in the community. So what are you hearing from workers, families, and communities, other folks that you are interacting with?
Well, I want to sort of, it's a perfect segue from Tracy's point about public services and what happens in that in Mississippi. It's interesting. Google TANF, Brett Favre at Mississippi, and so that, yeah, if you have time, and you'll hear about that and the water crisis in Jackson. So what's essentially happening is workers, again, we have this structural poverty, and again, we have those income workers in the state that have been dealing with these issues for decades, but it's now been sort of exacerbated when you combine the pandemic, which when the pandemic hit, you had a resource disparity. Even though there was significant resources from the federal government, you had such a resource disparity with vaccinations that Mississippi, and particularly the Delta region, had the highest, some of the highest mortality rates in the world. And so, and even now, the state is withholding about $2 billion in resources, in federal resources, are literally withholding it, and now currently, and not investing it in, for example, you've heard about the water crisis in Jackson, which about 2/3 of that money could literally fix the water. Right. Now it won't happen. And then when you look at, and again, the TANF scandal, which I'm sure you've heard about $75 million in federal welfare money that's been, misappropriated between politicians and athletes and, what have you. What no one talks about is the fact that with that TANF resources, as we all know, with the Welfare Reform Act of '96, it has allowed states to have block grants in which they had discretion how that money's allocated, and it took away basically a right to a due process right to cash assistance. Well, Mississippi, even before this scandal hit, had the most regressive allocation of TANF funds, to the point that literally only 211 families, our poorest families, get cash assistance at about a little over $100 a month. Before this whole scandal hit, before the money was, misappropriated. There are $47 million of those funds which are unused. And so Golden Tracy's point about childcare, part of those funds can be used as far as childcare subsidies. It is not. And so these workers are not only, structurally poor, are completely have no power as far as in their work environment, but then the public benefits, which the idea would help them and help provide some supports to low income workers so they can make it day to day, are non-existent, they're inaccessible. And now they're faced with both this water crisis, particularly those citizens in Jackson, with this water crisis, among other disasters, the COVID crisis that hit even before this water crisis in Jackson. In early last year, we had a winter storm and a water crisis and a food crisis at the same time. And I go even further. I can go on in the Bolivar County where I'm from. Come to find out, there's this apartment complex that's been making the news, that's been completely uninhabitable because they had a gas leak that killed 2 of the residents, and the rental company evacuated all the tenants, and now they're suing them in federal court for essentially making the facilities inhabitable. So I say all that to say that, in Mississippi, again, we have the poorest workers, they're dealing with the structural problems, but then they're bombarded with crisis, and that's just exacerbates it and makes it even worse. So to address these issues, we have, it's a matter of both addressing issues with public benefits to provide those supports in the short term, but also, yes, having a strategy to empower them as workers in the long term so they can have income, so they can have wealth. So a lot of these problems, which are problems of poverty, can be adequately addressed. And, again, when that point comes, we will talk about the solutions that the Anderson Institute are working on, which we're optimistic about. Again, optimism, we're keeping it optimistic. They were very, very optimistic about that we think can address those key areas.
We're going to get there, but we'll talk about a couple more things, though. I promise we'll get to some brighter topics, or at least some solutions. So everybody can kind of weigh on this one, but one major question is whether work today really does provide financial security for workers and their families. For many, we just know that it doesn't. And the main way we report on jobs in our national statistics, the monthly jobs report, is really focused on quantity of jobs created and not on job quality. So Sarah, let me start with you, and then I'll bring some other folks in. In a recent op-ed, you note that improving the quality of existing ones must be an essential goal. So further our economic recovery. And have we made any progress toward the goal of better quality jobs and better access to good jobs? And if not, why? And then I'll turn to Julian, Tracy, and Jake, and I will stick to the order that I said, I promise. But let's start with Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think it's a great question. And this is where I definitely have some, let's say, tempered optimism. There's certainly been a significant increase in focus on quality employment, and not just from those of us represented here on this call, and for a lot of us in the audience, from the intermediary, from the think tank, from the research advancement, from the education space. I think we are seeing a critical mass of employers really making investments in quality jobs as well. And in ways that go beyond kind of the in-name only commitment, I would say, that you saw in years past and maybe pre-pandemic times. As I'm sure many of you saw, recently the Aspen Institute and the Families and Workers Fund released kind of a working definition of what quality jobs means. And there's an impressive number of organizations sign on to that. They focus on equity, respect, voice, economic mobility, economic stability, everything that we've been talking about all day today. And that's been iterated time and time and time and time again in this system-wide project that we've been doing at the Federal Reserve, talking with workers. So I think that is a spot-on definition. It's not a shock to have workers want to be treated with dignity and respect and have a job that offers opportunity for growth or a culture for balancing their work and life responsibilities. So I think we're at a moment where the behaviors of workers and what we're hearing from them is really influencing a reevaluation on the business side as well. I mean, apropos, given the tightness of the labor market that we're in right now, but where I have tempered optimism is that we need to see wider spread and longer term adoption of these kind of quality frameworks of equitable investments in workforce development and talent development on behalf of business and industry. One key way that we see this really happening is around skills-based practices and strategies, as Dr. Bostic mentioned earlier. So, because far too often these workers are left out of great jobs simply because they don't have a bachelor's degree. They're hitting what, Opportunity at Work, I think, very aptly is referring to the paper ceiling. So how do we focus on our networks, our partners, employers within our spheres of influence to push them to think differently, not just about the quality of jobs that they offer, but also how do they think about their practices in a little bit of a different way. This behavior change is not going to come overnight. I will say that this is where I think the real work is going to happen from here on out. We need to partner hand in hand with employers to give them the skills to be able to do recruiting, hiring, development in a far more equitable way that values skills over credential, that values capabilities over networks and things like that. As a part of our partnership with the Rework America Alliance, we worked with a number of employers that went through a 12-week intensive training on just how to implement skills-based practices. And this is a massive, massive shift. I mean, it's this onion of changes that they need to make, from the job description to the applicant tracking system to support for hiring managers and everything in between. So I would say that there's quite a bit of work ahead for us. But I do think that there is a coalition of the willing. I think we just need to recognize that employers need our help to do this better. And we are in a very strong position to help to make the case and to do the research that shows all of the return on investment that we believe these practices are going to net for not just businesses, but also the workers in the economy.
Thanks, Sarah. Julian, you want to weigh in on this job quality topic?
Yes, and I sort of want to piggyback off Sarah's point. While yes, you're seeing this trend with businesses, the problem is it's not systemic, it's not operationalized in the law, because we're still at a point where worker, essentially the average worker makes more than makes, as far as purchasing power, makes the average worker today makes about the same when you adjust for inflation they did in 1975. And since that period of time, we've seen about an 80+% increase in worker productivity, but wages has essentially been stagnant. So there's this, since the 70s, there has just been this diversion from, this link between worker productivity and actually receiving the benefits of their work as far as profit and revenue. And so until we able to structurally, and again, there's so many, we could think of different factors, globalization, whatnot, all these different factors, but a big part of it about is unionization. The fact is that we are in, less than 7% of our private sector workforce is unionized. And so workers do not have that power to make sure that they get a bigger share of the revenue that their collective labor produces. And so until we can provide those protections legally as a matter of law, as far as labor protections and recognizing labor rights, so they can be in a position where they can, where they as a collective can be able to bargain and capture more of their of the revenue that their collective labor produces for living wages and benefits and what have you, then this problem still will be structural, even though the private sector would be more amenable to providing quality jobs. And again, until it's operationalized as a matter of law, then workers will still, across the board, will still be in the position they are, where the quality of their jobs, their benefits are less than what they were in the 70s. And like I said, and as far as upward mobility, my generation is the first generation essentially do less than parents. We make less than what our parents made at our age, 30% less than what our parents made at our age at this point in time. And so it's a matter of both greater labor protections, but also a greater recognition of universal economic rights, where where healthcare, retirement security, living wage job security, and education are essentially recognized as a right and not a privilege. And again, if you're a human being, you're born in this country, you have a right to a living wage job, to education, to healthcare, and to living wage retirement security.
Go on and preach. All right, Tracy.
Yeah, I'll be really brief here because I just want to mention one thing I don't think we've talked about. And I would say it's more of a, it's an area where I want to watch what happens, but with all the investments being made in broadband access, thinking about our more rural communities and what that might mean for access to educational attainment and upskilling and really creating additional job opportunities that quite frankly might simply not be available because prior to really the ability to learn remotely or be in a place where you can access those resources might not have been available. It might not still be available, but I think as we watch investments being made across the country, it's an important thing to think about what kind of opportunities will there be for people who might not live where there's a great access of jobs in their community, but can still live in their community and find jobs elsewhere in the country.
Thanks, Tracy. And Jake, do you want to round off the comments on job quality?
Sure, I'd agree with everything the panelists have said. One thing over the last couple of years that has really been kind of top of mind is just how issues that go beyond the wage level that were pretty peripheral, that many of us and many people in the audience have been researching and thinking about, but in terms of kind of broader public debates and in terms of worker expectations, these issues weren't front of mind, and suddenly they became central. And here I'm thinking about things like schedule certainty, which I know we're going to hear a lot more about in the days to come of the conference, sick leave, pay transparency, flexible work arrangements. And that I find is somewhat new and encouraging, kind of purely anecdotal. And I promise this is backed up by my more systematic research. But my spouse is a small business owner who does substantial hiring. Over recent years, I've watched as applicants and new hires, and these are for jobs up and down the economic ladder, that they're demanding things that weren't on the radar for many applicants years back. And I think there's reasons to cheer this development. My spouse might sometimes have a different short-term reaction, but I think understands the longer run importance.
Thanks, Jake. Okay, let's get into the solutions and discuss some of what can help sustain and amplify the positive trends that we've talked about today and address some of the challenges that y'all have referenced as well. So while we know that we have a lot to learn going forward, we also know that each of you bring careers worth of expertise about what works for creating opportunity for low-wage workers. And I'd like to give each one of you the opportunity to lift up one or two promising solutions for unlocking meaningful economic security and upward mobility for low-wage workers in the labor market. So Julian, if you don't mind starting, from your vantage point, what locally generated solutions or ideas seem particularly promising?
Of course, and I'll talk about two locally generated that we're working on with the Anderson Institute, and just one in federal solution in general. So again, I have the pleasure and privilege of working with a phenomenal group of organizers, economic justice advocates, and Dr. Lauren Long, who's the director of our stakeholder public policy program under the Institute, who's absolutely outstanding, to do some, I think, really great work. In Mississippi, we are the poorest state in the country, and so I think if we can make a solution work in Mississippi to address these issues, I certainly think it can be replicated. So a couple things. One, we are working on worker-owned cooperatives. So again, to truly challenge the monopoly that the private sector has on low-wage employment, we should have democracy in where people are all the time in their workplace. And so the idea of it is there's a $6 billion market for food. Just to give you a specific example, there's a $6 billion market for food in Mississippi. Local 90% of our food is imported, even though in Mississippi we have the most fertile soil in the world next to the Nile, only next to the Nile. So I've done for 15 years, my economic justice work is centered around developing sustainable community food systems. First in the Mississippi Delta region, focused on rural food systems, and now on our campus at Tougaloo College, focused on urban food systems. So one of the things we're doing is where we work with a coalition of statewide food justice organizations and farmers as part of the Mississippi Food Justice Collaborative to develop sustainable food systems, but also develop them in using a strategy of developing as worker-owned cooperatives. So we built a food system on our campus of Tougaloo which is student-led. Our students get living wages to work, to do and work with and lead. And so the goal is to replicate that model throughout the state so we can capture that $6 billion market for low-income communities. And so the idea is to alleviate poverty amongst individuals, because again, they literally get the value of their collective labor. They're paid, they're the owners. They get the money, they make the decisions as far as management. And so the idea is they capture this wealth to get them out of poverty, but also to provide revenue to address other significant social problems around healthcare and education state. Secondly, looking at it from a public benefits perspective, we're actually working with a partnership with the Mass Public Affairs Program at Brown University to do looking at utilizing our temporary assistance for needy families grant. Again, Google it, you'll understand why this is really going to work. We're utilizing our temporary assistance for needy families grant to fund a state earned income tax credit. Of course, Mississippi is one of 17 states across the country that does not have a state earned income tax credit to complement the federal earned income tax credit, which essentially, is for low income workers. And the idea of it is you get the federal credit, you're eligible for federal credit at a certain income, and it's dependent upon the number of children in your household. And the way the state credits work is it's just a percentage of the federal credit, and you get it as a refundable tax credit. So Mississippi doesn't have one, and so we published a white paper looking at how to establish a state earned tax credit for Mississippi workers, and we're hoping to be able to implement a pilot project with TANF recipients, 75% who are people of color, to be able to provide them a state earned income tax credit valued that would be 100% of the federal credit, and utilize that as a way and do it the same way the child tax credit was done, which essentially cut child poverty in half. It was provided as a monthly stipend, and it literally cut child poverty in half. So we're trying to create a pilot project to do that in the same way to help low-income workers move out of poverty into the middle class. And so we're working on that as a pilot project, hopefully implement in the spring. Finally, finally, just thinking about from federal solution, we need a federal jobs guarantee. I mean, we need a federal, again, the private sector should not have this monopoly on living wage job creation. And at the end of the day, we need to have universal employment. We recognize living wage job security as a right. Then we would establish a federal jobs guarantee for workers across the country that will not only include a living wage, really a true living wage is at least $28 an hour based upon inflation, but also benefits healthcare as well as paid sick leave. And so I think that truly would address our problem with economic insecurity and unemployment.
Thanks, Julie. That food justice work is super exciting. Thanks for mentioning that. Jake, how about a little bit from you on solutions? From your extensive knowledge of the evidence based on how workers build and sustain power, what things are you seeing that seem promising or at least give you a little bit of hope? Sure.
This is a great question. So if we take the kind of exit dimension of worker power, the ability to leave your current job for a better one elsewhere, we are staring right at a period of economic uncertainty and likely rising unemployment, and that's not going to help. But at the same time, you do have a growing list of policy efforts meant to empower workers who seek better employment options elsewhere, efforts that I would not have anticipated a few years ago. And the list is growing. They're not limited to things like new rules requiring employers to post salary ranges for available positions, right? So the idea here is to provide workers with more information about better opportunities within and beyond their current organization. Now, this type of law has been in operation in Colorado, Since January, I believe, goes into effect in New York City next month, barring any further court challenges. It looks like it's coming to California relatively soon too. Other efforts that I kind of hinted at earlier include policies to reduce schedule uncertainty, the kind of lack of advance notice about how many hours you'll be working and when you're expected to show up for work. So Seattle passed a schedule uncertainty ordinance a few years back. Oregon soon followed suit. And to the extent these types of policies are proven effective, and I do think people like me in my profession need to do the systematic evaluation, combined, they'll help buffer workers, I think, from the full effect of an economic downturn. And perhaps even more importantly, establish a new baseline for workers and for worker advocates about what should be expected from employers going forward. So I do think they contain the potential to empower workers in the years to come.
Great. Sarah, I'll turn to you. A recent Fed publication highlighting case studies and partnerships between public and private institutions recently came out. What can be learned from that work?
Yeah, I think it connects a little bit, Jake, to what you were just saying around like, how do employers think about this differently and invest in different ways? But I would say a lot of the research that we've been doing lately and the field building that we're trying to do is around broader financial innovations in the talent development space. So Raphael had mentioned, how do we create an infrastructure for skill building? That's not just the traditional higher education system for a number of different reasons, cost, length of time, risk that the student and the learner is bearing. I would say a lot of this work in the particular book that you referenced, I actually have right here. It's called Workforce Realigned. If you just Google that, it'll pop up and somebody might be able to drop that into the chat. But it does showcase a number of different ways employers, public policy, students as payers can think differently about how we're creating opportunities for constant skill building in a way that spreads risk. So it's not disproportionately being carried or solely carried by the student and the education provider. And that we're realigning our incentives. So think of different ways to pay for education, like an income share agreement or a pay it forward fund that a state may put in place or a region may put in place, or just different kinds of partnerships between a workforce board and an employer so that they're actually paying back into the system and have some skin in the game. I think absent the conversation so far has really been the need for people to continually upskill. We will keep seeing automation disrupt jobs and change skill complexions of occupations or just skill complexions of sectors. So upskilling in education is going to be a constant. And these are helping us to think a little bit differently about how we set up the financing for those, how we share the risk and share in the reward of that so that employers and public sectors and other places can become more investors of talent as opposed to consumers of it or spreading the risk in a way that really does incent workers to go and get additional education and pursue skill development in a way that their risk is mitigated and incented to do so.
Great. And finally, Tracy, can you talk a little bit about how human service providers can be part of the solution?
Absolutely. And at risk of bringing up something that Jillian's brought up a couple times already, I'm going to, because I think this is actually a policy change that I think could be really radical and helpful as we think about really achieving social and economic mobility for lowest wage workers. And that is the TANF program. There is a lot of opportunity to reimagine and adequately invest in that program. We haven't adjusted for inflation since it was developed in 1996. Reimagined, it could be a catalyst for thinking about the investments that states are making all across the country, right, as part of that pandemic relief and the American Rescue Plan Act. And think about really clearing a pathway for economic mobility for millions of Americans who many are in generational poverty and experiencing that generational poverty. And so we've been working at APHSA, the American Public Human Services Association, with state and local human service leaders across the country. And we've adopted 6 kind of core principles for modernizing this program that I think aligns a lot with what we are hearing from workers and families, what they are telling us that what they need. And they're brief, so I'm just going to read them to you, but then we can also put a link in the chat. The first is to help families achieve economic mobility. TANF must support the physical, social, and emotional well-being of individuals and their families. The second is that TANF must prioritize tailored solutions that help families succeed for the long term, right? So bridging to that long-term economic mobility. Third, TANF should foster conditions that advance a person's sense of agency over their life and belonging within their own community. Fourth is to best help families achieve their goals. TANF policies should be centered in evidence and promising practices that reflect the lived experiences of the families who are receiving those services. 5 is the broader workforce system has to provide coordinated continuum of services that support all job seekers' strengths, goals, and needs. And I think we've talked a lot about how the intersection of employment and education has to work alongside human services and health and justice, really to be effective. And number 6 is families must have access to adequate assistance and services that allow them to meet their basic needs while working up to achieve those long-term goals. And again, being able to mitigate and reduce the impact of the benefit cliff, for example, is something that would be a huge trajectory for the lowest wage earners that we see. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. All right, and we got a few questions from the audience that we can discuss. And so, Sarah, if you don't mind, there's one for you. Someone would like to learn or know more about some tools that are being used for non-degree individuals to work their way up in job title and salary within an organization. And this person says, I know that having a degree is not always the answer. So could you talk a little bit about that, some of those tools?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question. So thanks for sending that up to us. So when we talk about skills-based practices, skills-based hiring, skills-based development, that's what we're trying to chip away at. So how can employers look at talent pools, look at people coming from different areas of the economy and of the education ladder that don't have a degree, and getting them into these roles because they see that their skills and their capabilities are aligned with what they're looking for. I think there's been a lot of degree inflation in the labor market, certainly since the Great Recession. And we have a density of people with degrees. A lot of them at that time were underemployed. Now I think we have a lot of people that are grossly underemployed because they don't hold those degrees, though they are just as capable. So I hope that there's a number of tools that are out there or that are in development and coming soon that'll help all actors in this equation, that help employers to understand how they can promote skill forward jobs and apply skill focused interviews as opposed to just basing their talent pool on these have a degree, these don't. I'm only going to focus on those in the degree pile. There's tools that are out there to help people to build a resume in a way that is skill forward and not task forward. So it helps them better connect to the algorithms the job postings have out there. And also what I talked about with different ways of financing this. A lot of these different kinds of partnerships are really focused on quality education that's informed by employers and industry. And the cost of it doesn't necessarily have to be repaid unless you are paid above a certain wage threshold. Those don't necessarily net in degrees. In fact, in most cases, they don't. They're in short-term credentials or non-credit certifications and things like that. So I think it's a matter of ensuring that there's quality in those credentials and in those non-degree forms of education and training, that business values it, that there's currency, and that people are getting hired because of it. I think that is what we see in one of the biggest breakdowns is that if the measurement for being hired remains the bachelor's degree, we're doing a disservice to the population that you mentioned, and certainly the population that I try to focus on every day.
Thanks, Sarah. Got a couple of policy questions here. We'll see what we can, how many we can get to. What are some of the potential policy proposals that could improve the standard of frontline human, social, and health service jobs and give those workers some voice? Especially considering that lots of these folks are not in public sector jobs, they're in nonprofits. Does anyone want to weigh in on some potential policy solutions for those folks?
I'm happy to weigh in on this one, Kim. You know, I think it's really important, first of all, I appreciate the question because it's really important to understand that where our human services system is and the way in which we deliver supports is through public sector and community-based organizations who are most proximate, right, to the communities in which we are really trying to serve and support. And so that workforce is so incredibly important. And I have long thought about how powerful it might be if there was a way to create opportunities for folks to see, first of all, to really understand what the human services system is, to take the burden off of a workforce that often carries an unproductive narrative in the sense of blame for our human serving systems, and to create more opportunities for the state and local systems, the public sector systems, which often pass government dollars to community-based organizations to increase the opportunities and the wages and the experience, both in the public sector agencies as well as the community-based organizations. So I could imagine like a federal investment of increased match for states for a period of time to grow that workforce, right? Or something along those lines that could really, I think, have a huge impact. And it's important that we recognize that it's not just those public sector agencies. Most of them actually are in nonprofit community-based organizations that are on the ground and often have the trust of community.
Thanks, Tracy. Here's one about research, and maybe this one might be good for Jake. I wonder if you could talk about what you folks think are the most urgent questions for researchers and where we have some needs there.
Sure. We've learned over the last couple of years how important the firm at which you work is to your wages, to your working conditions, to your opportunities for upward mobility. That might sound ridiculous. Obviously, companies differ. Companies in the same industry employing the same types of workers can and do differ in how they treat their employees. Workers know this. Academics have largely overlooked it. And we overlooked firm level differences largely because we didn't have quality data to examine them. Recently, the data has gotten better. A lot of this data, though, is coming from overseas. The number of papers I've read from Sweden and Germany is now getting to be a bit too much. And so in the US, we still do lack the kind of data infrastructure that has quality firm level data, interviews with workers all the way from top to bottom, describing difficulties in getting hired, describing the hiring process, along with all the kind of standard economic indicators that we get on kind of our national or industry level or occupational level surveys. Those voices, both from the C-suite executives all the way down to the building cleaners in the firms, I think are really essential. I'm so thrilled to hear about efforts that Sarah and others have talked about gathering those voices kind of going forward. And I think the promise of WorkRise and kind of allied organizations is to really help fill that research gap.
Great, thanks so much, Jake. And many thanks to all of you panelists for a really fascinating discussion about this current economic moment. On the ground insights from practitioners combined with the knowledge of those steeped in research really does provide us with a clear picture on where workers are at now and what we need to do to support them in the future. And it's really my pleasure to introduce the next panel, which is going to explore innovative ways to ensure that workers themselves are at the table in shaping the decisions that will determine the future of work in America. So it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, Elizabeth Jacobs. Woo woo. Elizabeth is the Deputy Director of WorkRise and a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. She's worked in research and policy on issues of family, economic security, and economic mobility for nearly 2 decades. Prior to joining Urban, she held positions at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, the Brookings Institution, the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, and with the late Senator Ted Kennedy. With that, Elizabeth, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kim. I'm so delighted to be with all of you today to moderate our next panel, which centers the voice and the perspective of workers themselves. So workers' voices are often missing from the decision-making table, and too often policies and programs are designed and rolled out and funding decisions are made without asking workers themselves Will this actually meet your needs? Does this policy or program reflect your lived experience? And what are your ideas for how the government or employers can support you? So what's really exciting, I think, in this moment is that many organizations are taking a step back and realizing that they have to have workers at the table. You simply can't pursue a strategy for supporting upward mobility without centering and giving voice to what workers themselves say they want and need. And these organizations really consider workers as co-creators in building and designing solutions for upward mobility. So one of those organizations is the Families and Workers Fund, which is a new philanthropic collective that launched in response to the economic devastation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The fund is a multi-donor pooled fund dedicated to supporting workers and families hit hardest by the pandemic and creating jobs that sustain and uplift. Through two core programs, Recovery Up and the 21st Century Benefits Program, the fund supports organizations that create job pathways into economic security and mobility, and those that are dedicated to repairing and reimagining our public benefit system. Most relevant to our conversation today, the Families and Workers Fund is guided in their work by an Essential Leaders Council. It's a group of frontline workers and leaders who provide direct input on the fund's grant making and policy strategy. And I'm delighted to invite Tianka Perkins-Ramawi, who's a member of the Families and Workers Fund leadership team, as well as June Barrett, a member of the Essential Leaders Council, to join me in a conversation about worker voice and job quality. Tianka is a senior program manager with the Families and Workers Fund, and as the fund's primary grant maker, Tianka sources, assesses, and manages grants and supports grantee partners to achieve their greatest possible impact and influence. And June Barrett is a member of the Essential Leaders Council. June is a longtime home health care worker and has spent the past 20 years advocating for and speaking out on behalf of home care and domestic workers. So I want to start off the conversation, Tianka, with you. Can you tell us a little bit about why the Families and Worker Fund decided to establish the Essentials Leaders Council, why it's so important to center the voices of workers in your organization's philanthropic decision-making, and how the ELC is an essential part of your strategy, or how it will become one?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for having June and I here today. Well, it's important to us at the fund that we center the voices of workers in real time, because we never want our work to occur or in an echo chamber, or to be removed from what would actually be impactful for people in communities that we care most about. And that is workers and families who are most locked out of opportunity, who are most unprotected, and who are most discriminated against in this country. And despite assumptions that may exist about these folks, they know what's best for themselves and their families, just like me, you, and every person here today. They're experts in what needs to be improved and how to do that. Although the Essential Leaders Council is really formalizing now, we actually had our first official group meeting last night. Early members of this group have already greatly impacted the fund strategy. At first, this started as an informal practice. At the start of the pandemic, when we were forming our strategy and early grant making in 2020, we consulted with grantees and movement leaders deeply connected to families and workers, especially essential workers, as well as people with lived experience themselves. And we deepened that practice last year when the fund officially launched. As we solidified our focus on good jobs and the safety net, we asked grantees if they knew people and essential workers directly impacted by challenges in these areas who would be interested in helping us and our co-funders shape our focus and work. That started with a conversation between these leaders and the leadership of the fund's co-funders about what a good job means to essential workers and ways our collaborative philanthropy could advance good jobs and job quality. As we began our work to create a foundational definition of good jobs that could be commonly understood and adopted, we continued engaging this group, along with groups of diverse leaders in business, labor, workforce development, and policy. We've also presented and spoken to the media with these leaders, and now that we're moving into our signature grant making for the year, we will engage the group that is now formalizing to get their feedback on our thoughts and recommendations about grant making so far, as well as their thoughts and recommendations for what else should be included in our grant making.
Fabulous. Thanks, Tianka. So June, I want to turn to you with the same question. As Tianka mentioned, the council's new, you're just getting started and you had your very first official meeting last night. So I'd love to hear from you from your perspective. What do you hope to accomplish as a council?
Okay, yes, so first let me start by saying thank you so much for inviting me here on this panel this evening, deeply appreciated. So literally last night was my third meeting with the council, but last night was our official kickoff of the Family and Fund Worker Council. And I must also say that we have been working because we were very much instrumental in helping to create the good job definition that was officially launched recently. Also, I've worked with Tianka because in July of this year, we also participated in a panel discussion around good job quality and the future of work. So, you know, as I said, last night was just the official kickoff of the council. Let me start by saying, as a marginalized worker, as a domestic worker, this is huge for me to be given a seat at the table to center not just my voice, but the voices of 2.2 million domestic workers across the country. And what I most like about this worker council is that we are the ones who will be in the room speaking to the advisory boards and funders, and also giving advice on organizational grants. And that's the way it should be. We should have the people with the lived experience sitting at the table. And I'm so excited that we are given a front and center at this table.
Thank you. I want to stay a little bit with you, June, just so we can learn a little bit more about your background. I know I mentioned in the introduction that you've been a home health care worker for many years, but tell us a little bit more, if you would, about your own background and how you became a leader and an advocate in the domestic workers movement.
So I'm a Jamaican immigrant, and I came to the United States in 2001. And, domestic work was one of the easiest jobs to find. So I started out in the field working as a nanny. But in 2003, when I moved to Florida, I accidentally went into home care, and I stick to home care. And from the first day walking on the job, I was called the N-word because apparently the person did not want the N-word as a care worker. And that abuses went on, wage theft, sexual harassment, it was too much. And so in 2016, I've been involved, in social justice work, but not really taking on the domestic workers issue. But in 2016, we at the Miami Workers Center decided that now is the time, this is the moment. There was too many cases of wage theft, sexual harassment, and discrimination. And so we started in 2016, and I have not looked back since. I am a leader right now with the We Dream in Black project, which is an initiative within the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And so a part of my work is working with organizing Black domestic workers, and because our experience is totally different, right? And so the Alliance made this decision to craft and create this special place for We Dream in Black. And so during our organizing work, we came against so much cases of wage theft. And sexual harassment was something that was being, swept under the rug. Domestic workers were turning up because of what they were experiencing. And so in 2018, we got together with farm worker women and started a movement called Enough is Enough. And then we have a really huge culture change because we intersected with the Me Too movement. And so not just me, one of the global, not national or local, but a global voice, and kind of like shift the way in which domestic workers were dealing with sexual harassment. I'm very active in the Miami Worker Center. I'm the board chair. And once again, we are battling wage theft, and we are trying to get local laws passed here in Miami-Dade against wage theft and anti-discrimination for 3 years. For 3 years, and we can't, because people are saying we do not want people to regulate our homes, and so we keep fighting. And I got deeply involved with the Alliance. I was a fellow with the Alliance for 3 years. I'm currently working on their culture change team And so that's some of the work that I'm doing to help to, spin the narratives, right? And to allow people like myself to tell our own story and, to work to make the change, of course, along with the professionals, the policymakers, organizers, and so on.
Thank you. It's just amazingly inspirational, all of the different hats you wear and how powerfully you speak to all of them. So thank you so much for that. So Tianka, I want to turn it back to you. Last year, the Families and Workers Fund announced a plan to invest $25 million to advance good jobs for people of color, women and caregivers, and others in low-wage, precarious work. So in collaboration with a group of impressive partners, including our mutual friends at the Aspen Institute, you all recently released a good job statement that provides a working definition of the numerous dimensions and elements of what constitutes a good job. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about how the statement came to be and how putting out this statement helps advance the cause of good jobs today and in the future.
Sure. So, as we began our work to create a foundational definition of good jobs that could be commonly understood and adopted, we continued engaging with the Essential Leaders Council. To create the Good Jobs Champions framework that was just released 2 weeks ago, we convened a group of diverse leaders in business, labor, workforce development, policy, and the nonprofit sector to study the many current definitions of job quality and synthesize tons of research, including polling, on what matters most to workers. Then we workshopped what was starting to come together with these leaders and the Essential Leaders Council, as well as leaders from small and large companies. That resulted in the release of the Good Jobs Champions framework as a truly shared definition of job quality. It has buy-in from over 200 leaders across sectors, including business, labor, investing, and more. And the framework can help advance the cause of good jobs because now that we have a common, broadly shared definition of what makes a job good, we can advance action to achieve good jobs and measure that action against a tangible baseline. And a definition alone can't fix the problem, but a more concise framework that has broad buy-in can be an important tool for stakeholders who create jobs and influence the quality of jobs to center job quality in their policies, business practices, and investment strategies.
So June, I'll turn it back to you with the same question. What do you think are the essential elements of a good job?
Okay, let me start by saying, I must always bring in the domestic worker. I am a domestic worker and a home care worker. And, right now, domestic workers, we are excluded from, labor protections, right? So a good jobs for us would mean, let's start by saying a livable wage. A job with good benefits, sick days, a job with paid vacation, and above all, contracts. That's what a good job will look like for us. And of course, protections under the laws, as we are fighting right now for a national domestic workers bill of rights. And I must say, for this to happen to my work industry, because my work industry is a complex work industry, we are alone behind closed doors, no HR, no middleman, it's just we and them. So hence, it's policy that is going to make our job be a good job. And that means getting a national bill of rights passed for all domestic workers. So when the bill is passed, all the protections in that bill is going to be making our jobs be good jobs.
And if I could just add, a lot of the things that June mentioned, you'll see reflected in the definition as well as feedback that we received from other members of the Essential Leaders Council. And there will be an accompanying pathways to action with, actions that different stakeholders can take from their different points in the system to create good jobs that will speak to, what policymakers could do, or business, corporate leaders or investors, or even people in philanthropy. And so that document will be released soon and reflect a lot of recommendations from the Essential Leaders Council as well.
Fabulous. So I think there are some concrete solutions buried in there, but I want to turn to a direct question about solutions or concrete actions that folks in our audience could take today. And keeping in mind that our audience includes folks from the employer community, it includes worker advocates, it includes researchers, it includes philanthropists. So it's a really broad set of actions that apply. What should folks who want to improve opportunity and security for all workers, and especially those who've been historically included, what should folks be doing to make positive changes both now and heading forward? And I'll let either one of you jump in.
I would love for June to jump in as the expert here. Oh, you're on mute, June.
Every single time. Yes, to the wonderful audience who are here this evening, I would like to say that, to make our work be better work, right? Because care work is essential work. The pandemic has shown us how essential we are, but yet we are not covered under basic protection. And I must clarify that right now we have 10 states with a Bill of Rights and 2 cities. Domestic workers need all the support that we can have to fight for change, to fight to get the National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. And the National Domestic Workers Alliance is an organization that works for the respect, recognition, and rights for 2.2 million domestic workers, nannies, house cleaners, and home caregivers. I would encourage folks to become an ally to the Alliance, because the Alliance is really working. As I said, right now, we recently introduced the Federal Bill of Rights, and we came up against some roadblocks, and we are asking for folks to support this Bill of Rights and to support the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the Miami Worker Center, who is fighting on the ground right now to end wage theft and human trafficking of domestic workers. And the list goes on. So I am appealing to the audience to hear my heart's cry, which is the heart cry of 2.2 million of us in this country.
Thank you. It's powerful. Tianka.
I mean, I'll just say it's important to center workers. Again, they know what's best for themselves and their families, just like me and you. They're the experts. And so my advice is to find a way to engage people who are most proximate to your work in a way that is respectful, dignified, and mutually beneficial. If you don't have that expertise, you can seek ways to collaborate with groups that already exist. We didn't set out to create an Essential Leaders Council. It developed informally through our relationships. I know members of our group would be happy to support the work of others trying to build a more equitable economy. And there are other organizations working with groups of workers and families who are willing to do the same.
Fantastic. I love the generosity of spirit. And I think that's so much of what WorkRise is aiming to do, is to create a space where we can lift up what's happening out there in the world and make it more efficient for us to actually collaborate and work together. So I encourage folks who are listening to be in touch with us, or be in touch with the Families and Workers Fund, or be in touch with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Whatever resonated with you from this conversation, please don't hesitate to follow up, because that's really part of what we're here to do. So I'm going to wrap us up. I think we all could probably keep on talking for quite some time, but I want to be sure to be mindful of everyone's schedules and wrap us up on time. Thank you so much, Tianka, and especially to you, June, for your time, for your insights on a topic that, as I said, we could spend quite some more time talking about, and I hope we have the opportunity to in the future. And now I have the privilege of introducing the closing speaker for today, Don Howard, who's the president and CEO of the James Irvine Foundation. Don leads the foundation in pursuit of a singular goal, which is ensuring all low-income workers in California have the power to advance economically. He's been with the Irvine Foundation since 2012, and his long career spans roles in philanthropy and foundation and nonprofit strategy. The Irvine Foundation is a core funder of WorkRise. We've gotten to benefit from Don's expertise, and we are extremely honored and grateful for their support, as well as for your participation in the conference today, Don. So with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just found all of today's sessions super interesting and inspiring. I want to thank WorkRise, all the conference partners, and all of the speakers today who are certainly thought-provoking. Let me recap a little bit of the day's core themes. Today, we heard a variety of perspectives on our current economic moment and how the mixed signals of the economy. You've got rising wages for the lowest paid workers on one hand and higher prices that stress household finances on the other. And we got to hear about how those dynamics are influencing macroeconomic policies, social programs, and the everyday decision-making of people and families. Many thanks to Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic and National Urban League President Mark Morial for providing some context and some insights on how these economic trends are and shedding light on how federal policymakers and community-based organizations are thinking about these issues. In the Research to Action panel, we heard from Julian Miller of Tougaloo College on the innovative ways local communities are approaching economic justice and development. I want to say thanks to Sarah Miller of the Atlanta Fed, Jake Rosenfield of Washington University and St. Louis, and Tracy Waring Evans at APHSA for sharing a national perspective on strategies to increase worker power, partnerships to strengthen local and regional workforce ecosystems. I really appreciated learning more about the human-centered approach to human and social services delivery. So thanks, Elizabeth and Chianca, for your leadership. And I just want to say a heartfelt thanks to June Barrett, a home care worker and a member of the Families and Workers Fund Essential Workers Council, for coming here today to share her experiences as an essential worker during the pandemic and the recovery. And I just want to say Irvine is proud to support the National Domestic Workers Association that you're part of. June, your perspective was really inspiring. Your comments underscore why it's so important to have workers' voices at the table when we try to create social and economic policies that support upward mobility. I want to share one or two priorities for Irvine as we close. From our perspective at Irvine, we believe that particularly in this uncertain economy, philanthropy has a critical role to play in protecting progress and continuing the momentum to ensure that workers have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, especially in communities with changing economies and communities that are too often overlooked. I got to be recently with our board of directors in San Bernardino in California's Inland Empire. For those who don't know the Inland Empire, it's incredibly diverse and one of California's fastest growing economies. While we were there, we heard from local leaders and organizations about the opportunities and challenges facing workers there who are earning low wages. They face really deep structural barriers to opportunity and really vast racial disparities in income, education, housing, and environmental issues. While we were there, we heard a lot about low wage and low quality jobs and how they prevent workers in the community from thriving. But despite those challenges, I came away optimistic by much of what I heard and saw. Couple things that really were inspiring. There's more support for building worker power right now. 71% of Americans approve of unions, and that's the most since 1965. One thing we saw in the Inland Empire was real inroads that are being made by organizations like the Warehouse Workers Resource Center, and they're developing effective strategies to organize workers in the supply chains of key companies like Amazon and Walmart. Another thing that was inspiring was to see an increased focus on quality jobs and efforts to ensure that women and people of color in particular have access to and are prepared to fill them. We at Irvine got to sign on to the recently released definition of what constitutes a good job that was put forward by the Good Jobs Champions group. And we have a huge appreciation for the Families and Workers Fund, which we're part of, the Aspen Institute, and their partners who led that effort. It's really important for philanthropy to invest at the local level to advance the cause of low-wage workers. And while there are challenges ahead, there's also real opportunity to ensure workers and their families are at the center as we build an economy that works for everybody. Let me give just a little preview of what's coming tomorrow. We're going to pivot to hearing from another important group of stakeholders, employers. They have a lot at stake, ensuring workers have clear pathways to advancement. We'll hear from leaders at Johnson & Johnson, PayPal, Bain Capital, and the Business Roundtable on how private sector employers are thinking about economic mobility, career advancement, and strategies for creating inclusive and equitable workplaces. We're also going to get to hear from scholars and practitioners on evidence-based practices related to inclusive hiring, upskilling, and job quality, many of the themes that follow on from today's conversation. We're also going to hear from the president and an alum of Benjamin Franklin Cummings Institute of Technology. They're a career and technical college in Boston, helping students from disadvantaged backgrounds build their careers in high-wage, high-growth industries. We really hope you'll join us for day 2 of the conference. And don't forget, you can use the same link you used today to attend. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.